Hello, Mr. Moore. How's it going?
Hello, Mr. Ajmani. Can you hear the sweet sounds of Stargate SG-1 from upstairs?
What are you talking about?
I'm guessing that's a no, so we're good. Audio is great. How's it going for you? What have you been up to?
Well, just kind of just chilling at home. Originally, I was planning on going somewhere during winter break, probably going to Florida or just like getting outside the house. But then I realized that COVID is still, a thing. And I don't want to get sick before my term starts, especially because I plan to do EMT training. And if I get sick for that, I can't get my training done. And that's going to be like a whole mess because that's pretty expensive. How about you?
Yeah, I drove up to Michigan to see my grandma from outside a window. So like we were still far apart. And I don't really see why that's better than a Zoom call, but I she liked seeing us from 12 feet away through a window. Um, and then also we then dipped down to Ohio and I saw my nephew Thomas. And when I walked in, he said hi, to everyone else, but not to me. Uh, and then we asked him, "Aren't you?" My mom asked him, "Aren't you going to say hi to your uncle Donovan?" And he looked at me and said, "Hi, Donovan. Are you the new Donovan? You look different." And he like pointed up to my hair. And I said, "No, no, it's just my hair's grown longer." And he said, "Oh, you have grandma hair now." Um, so yeah, I might be a little overdue for a haircut, but that was my break, and I've just been playing video games and writing stuff for fun since then.
Yeah, when your nephew is calling you a grandma, I think that's the time where you get a haircut, Donovan. I think
Yeah,
that's like the epiphany you need in life to really get you switching directions. I
I
mean,
don't know.
I do you want to discuss any Christmas presents you got?
I got some tiles, the stuff so you don't lose stuff.
Oh, those are super useful.
Yeah, I don't currently know where the package is, but we'll figure that out. I got some new clothes, um, and he's walking away. That's my brother Chris, our guest from last time. Oh, he's walking back because I mentioned him. Now he's walking away again. Exciting. Um, but yeah, I got a bunch of new books. So I have a lot of homework given to me for Christmas, which is always exciting. But that's mainly it. What about you? Ayush, any holiday gifts?
Not really. I just decided I'm just gonna save up any like gifts, just redeem them for something more expensive later on whenever I decide to get something. But I did see your parents or parent at Costco buying two coats for Chris. It
Yeah.
was quite interesting. And well, we were getting some bed sheets because they were quite cheap.
Hey, Costco has all the best deals. Hashtag not sponsored. Hashtag sponsor us, Costco.
Please, I love Costco so much and their samples. Anyway, do you want to get us started on today's episode and some events that we're going to be covering?
Yeah, so this episode, we're going to be covering a couple different events and also sort of using those events as a springboard to have some wider conversations. So our first one is about the Nashville bombing that happened a couple weeks ago now. And one of the reasons why we haven't started talking about this much before now is because information has been coming in pretty slowly. And at first, when I first saw a news report, it said explosion in Nashville, 3 people injured, no dead. And I said, well, it's good that, obviously you don't want to see any explosion or 3 people injured, but it seemed to me good that it was only three. And so I thought it must have been a pretty small explosion. But then a little bit later, I saw a news report that showed, an image of where the explosion had occurred, and it devastated, multiple blocks. You could see buildings caved in throughout, and so the actual reason why the casualty was so low, despite it being quite a large explosion, is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and before you really delve into that, just to get like an idea of how big the explosion was, it was reported that over 144 buildings and stores were affected by the explosion. So that's a pretty big explosion, and the wide-reaching impacts affected like multiple states, including Tennessee.
Yeah. Um, and so the reason less people weren't hurt, and the reason why no one, besides we would later find out the bomber himself, the suicide bomber, was killed, was because the bomb was a vehicular bomb, but it started playing a countdown saying, I don't remember the exact line of the recording, but basically telling people this car is going to explode in 15 minutes, evacuate. And then first responders who were at the scene then went around waking people up to make sure they actually evacuated. And then, just after the 15 minutes had gone by, um, the explosion happened.
Yeah, and I don't think the recording necessarily mentioned the explosion part. I think if you're hearing this message, please evacuate now. So when the explosion actually happened at the end of those 15 minutes, people were like freaking out, like, and like were devastated because a lot of people were just sleeping in the area and they wake up to like a loud bang, multiple buildings caving in, like floods devastating a lot of businesses in that area because of pipelines like breaking. And it was quite tragic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tragic because I mean those buildings obviously represent, lots of investments, a lot of hard work for a lot of people. But the it's hard to say good news when the good news would have been waking up and not seeing any news reports from Nashville. But I guess the hopeful note is that there is no one who was killed from this attack, which does it also seems because of this warning that was not the goal of the bomber either. And another strange thing that we learned at the same time was that the RV, in addition to this warning, it was playing this song "Downtown," which is just a very sad, wistful song. And so I was talking to my brother about that, right as we saw that report, and it seemed like this whole thing seemed sort of comic booky to us, this sort of bombing, and we also wondered, was this like a distraction for something of some sort? Because we also reported that some people had heard gunshots, and some people were speculating that the report of gunshots may have been a trick to try to lure police officers to the scene. But that does not seem to be the case, as although it is true they haven't actually been able to find any proof that there was any sort of actual weapons fire. There were a couple of different claims of gunfire, not just one. And some people have stepped forward and saying, "Yeah, I thought I heard gunfire, so I called." And so that's another mystery that we don't know if it's part of it. But my brother and I were. It seemed a strange event. We were wondering, would we find who did this? And then a couple days later, we saw, they had found, the RV through tips from neighbors and on a Google image search. And then, once they had that RV in the house, they were able to figure out who did it. And then from there, a lot of more interesting stuff came in. The first thing was that this person's girlfriend had actually called in 2019 and said, I think this person's girlfriend had called and I said, I think my boyfriend is making weapons. And the police didn't really follow up on that, which is obviously in hindsight, very concerning.
So it was not necessarily just like a little quick note on that because I'm pretty sure the police tried to follow up on that, but they really didn't have reasonable evidence in order to conduct a search of his home because I know his lawyer and everything were just kind of like denying it and not letting it happen. But I'm pretty sure the police did try to end up searching his like home for these explosives and stuff. Which to also think about it, if it's like a jeopardy of like security in the region, I feel like the police has methods to get away, like get around it and obtain a search warrant, which I feel like they just didn't do.
Yeah. So a couple things on that. So basically what happens is this woman, his girlfriend calls and is pretty clearly, having a mental breakdown, which I think is a response you can sort of understand from someone who is kind of ending a relationship in which their boyfriend has started to believe in conspiracy theories and is talking about building weapons. But that the fact that she was clearly and like by her own admission having a mental breakdown at the time, and ended up being actually referred by the police to a psychiatrist, kind of maybe led them to take the claims with a little bit less credibility. And then yes, they did go and knock on this person's door, and then he didn't answer. And the interesting thing is that the police say that they forwarded this person's name to the FBI, and the FBI said, we have no evidence on him. And then the police claim that the lawyer kind of said that I'm going to make it difficult for you to try to follow up on this. But the lawyer says that he denies that, and that he was not actively part of this, of Anthony Warner, the suicide bomber. His lawyer says that he wasn't a criminal defense lawyer. He had helped him with a lawsuit a little bit ago, and that he had nothing to do with telling the police they couldn't do this. So that's a conflicting report. But to your point, Ayush, that they have ways they could have maybe gotten the search warrant for this, that actually relates to another issue that a lot of people have been talking about, in which they say there's a sort of a double standard in how the media is talking about this, because people generally aren't calling him a suicide bomber, even though objectively it was. And then people are also somewhat saying that the media isn't calling him a terrorist. And while since we don't currently have a motive, it is true he doesn't technically meet the definition of terrorism. In certain examples where an individual who is Muslim has committed a crime, FBI officials have said stuff without any knowledge of the case. Like from the get-go, we are investigating this as terrorism until proven otherwise, which is clearly a double standard from what they're doing here. And so I think there would be some people who are saying that if they had gotten a report about a Muslim or an Arab man building bombs, would the police have tried harder to get that warrant, and would they have actually conducted their investigation differently?
Yeah, and then moreover, would there have been more like public like push towards trying to get like more information on the subject if it wasn't necessarily a white person committing the crime? So kind of also transitioning onto some of the impacts of the incident. So outside of those three people and like the bomber being killed, the three people being injured, the bombing was near like the AT&T building in Nashville. And it was also next to a server building which housed a bunch of communication servers. So in the aftermath of the explosion, even though like backup generators kicked in for a few hours to keep the communication lines online, the like massive flooding and fires took out those communication networks pretty quickly, and that had like very far reaching impacts. So like multiple areas or multiple states, multiple cities, like thousands of people didn't have access to any service for very prolonged periods of time. This is not like a few hours, this is like multiple days. And then moreover, there were banks and like credit card machines, ATMs, like all these different services that relied on AT&T's cell tower in the region or like communication hub in the region, where they just weren't able to function, and there was a huge like impact on consumers. And I think most detrimental is that first responders, as a result of the incident, who relied on AT&T's communication service, just couldn't like get calls from people. So people who needed to reach out to 911 weren't able to dial the police or fire department or like hospitals, and there was like a like delayed response for a lot of emergencies. And it also begs the question why such a like integral part of our communication hub is so loosely protected. Like if that building dictates so many people's lives and their livelihood and just like is a huge part of making sure that everyone is living a normal life, why doesn't it have further protections?
Yeah, I think this is kind of a much broader take on this. But if you look at countries such as China or even Russia, where power is very much concentrated in the state, they sometimes have easier time of securing key infrastructure because the only thing that matters is what the government wants secured. Whereas us, it's not the government; it's AT&T, and there's also other telephone companies that compete with them, and so on. And so, I think you could argue that there are benefits from competition and having free markets and freedom to choose different options for communication. But the harm of that is you often find that you have more options, but every single option is less secure than it could be. And I think, I don't think we need to implement a great firewall and like clamp down, but I think improving all sorts of our digital infrastructure is a key, and the security of it is a key thing for our government to focus on.
Yeah, and kind of just like paralleling on the China thing, it's kind of like a decentralized, centralized response. In the US, it's always more decentralized because we don't want like government overreach, while in China, it's just one government really controlling everything. So they can have a much more like centralized response, even like seen during COVID, where they were able to like shut down entire cities without like necessarily any backlash against the government. But most of that was silenced by the Chinese government most of the time.
Yeah, which is once again a good example of the double-edged sword of what they're doing with there.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that idea of sort of conflicting, federal and different levels of government actually relates to our next story, Ayush.
Yeah, I mean that perfectly transitions us on. Yeah, in more recent developments, we saw that there was a phone call between President Trump and the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. I'm just going to be calling him Brad from now on. I do not like to pronounce his last name. But between President Trump and the Georgia Secretary of State, they had a phone call on Saturday with multiple other people attending. And within that phone call, numerous accounts of election fraud were discussed by President Trump. But what was most alarming, and this is why a lot of people are starting to freak out, is because President Trump was directly starting to ask the Georgia Secretary of State to rig the election in his favor. And this is not like just like plain, hey, can you just like try to do another recount, or kind of, it's straight up like, can you find this many votes and change the result of the election? It's not going to be too much. And if people ask, you just say that we recalculated, right? There are multiple direct quotes of President Trump saying this in the hour-long conversation that he had with the Georgia Secretary of State and his lawyer, Ryan. And within that, he just like was always asking like, hey, we clearly won the state. Hundreds of thousands of votes that were Republican were never fully counted. We won the state. A lot of voters are mad. We want you to like I just want to find quote unquote 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have because we won the state. Referring to Joe Biden, who won the state by 11,779. And it's quite interesting because he tried to play like the card that you're a Republican, you should be supporting me multiple times throughout that conversation. And I think it really shows a break in the Republican establishments, because you see more Trump heavy supporters starting to move away from the ideologies of the base of the Republican Party. That's why a lot of past Republican presidents were unwilling to support President Trump in the most recent election. But moreover, you can see the Georgia Secretary of State saying that, like, you're completely wrong, Mr. President, and we believe that we have an accurate election, and what you're saying is just completely wrong. And I feel like it's just creating a huge divide between the current people who support President Trump and the voters who really stand for all the ideologies that the I guess establishment stands for. Do you have anything to add, Mr.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he is asking for voter fraud in this. And his supporters will say, well, he's not telling them to create votes; he's telling them to find votes and claiming, that they're already there. But there are a couple of things that kind of make that, even by Trump's own words, seem kind of silly. Because later in the call, in response, Brad, as we're calling him, we're on first name basis. He says that we believe we do have an accurate election. And then Trump responds, no, you don't, not even close. You're off by hundreds of thousands of votes. But he only cares about them finding like the exact amount he needs to win. So clearly he's being inconsistent. Even if he believes they're off by 100,000 of votes, he's saying, just give me 11,000 because they're there, which is clearly still asking him to just fudge results. He's just saying, fudge it in the direction I want you to. And the other thing is, it's kind of like Ayush. If I was hiring you to be like an assassin. I just said I wanted you to find a dead body. Like that dead body has to be created somehow.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, it also definitely shows the discrepancy between President Trump and the establishment, because more recently, in looking ahead to Wednesday's joint session of Congress, 11 senators who are currently and incoming Republican senators have vowed to reject the electoral results and side with President Trump until the election is lawfully certified with a commission that is set up by Congress within the next 10 days. And it's quite interesting because the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Vice President Pence threw out multiple, weren't willing to really follow up on many cases that were filed by representatives and senators in various states that were contesting the election. I know Vice President Pence multiple times just kind of like shrugged off those things, like kind of admitting that President Trump lost the election without necessarily saying it. Because if you're just pushing aside those lawsuits are like the foundation of your claim of election fraud, your claim of towards the U.S. presidency.
Yeah, they're dancing around telling the truth because they don't want to make Trump angry. And our local Senator Hawley, who everyone knows is trying to run for president in 2024, even though his first ever campaign ad was him saying, "I'm not trying to climb ladders. I'm here to just work in Missouri government." That's besides the point. He's one of the people saying that he'll try to delay this and ask for this commission. It's a lot. It's a concerning number, I would say, if you want American democracy to like function at all, but it's not enough to change the result. And even if they somehow delayed this certification in the Senate, if no one is president by January 20th, that would actually make the Speaker of the House next in line, and which would be Nancy Pelosi. So I would say Republicans' best case scenario is President Pelosi.
I mean, President Pelosi, Speaker of the House Pelosi was confirmed for her position once again. She was voted in by a narrow margin. I believe, I'm not sure the exact amount, but I know that it's a pretty narrow margin.
I believe it was 116 to 109.
Okay, so like 7-ish votes.
Yeah.
That were dictating whether she would be Speaker of the House or not. And I mean, I think something needs to point out with Josh Hawley, Senator Ted Cruz, and like a bunch of other senators like calling that, hey, we're not going to be supporting the electoral college results. Chuck Schumer, who's the minority leader of the Senate, is just like, you want to investigate election fraud? And then he tweets at the phone call between President Trump and the Georgia Secretary of State, which is quite interesting because Josh Hawley and all these people have just kind of turned a blind eye to that phone call. But that's pretty recent because the phone call just took place yesterday and it was leaked out today.
Yeah. How did it get out actually? Like this recording?
So I'm not exactly fully sure on that, but I have some speculations because I know the Washington Post like released that phone call today, but to like understand how, to try to put a little background to the situation, yesterday or like 10-ish hours ago, President Trump said that I spoke to the Secretary of State, Brad, about Fulton County and voter fraud in Georgia. He was unable to answer questions about ballots under the table, scam ballots, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. And in a response to that tweet, Brad said, respectfully, President Trump, what you're saying is not true. The truth will come out. And I think he was the one who leaked the conversation to the Washington Post, thus referring to the truth will come out, because the phone call, as like the audio as reported by the Washington Post, came out like after that tweet stuff, after like all that Twitter shenanigans took place. And I think it's just interesting because like more and more senators and more Republicans are starting to turn on President Trump, and just like they're kind of just done with what's happening. Even his own vice president's kind of getting tired of the situation.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where the Republican Party goes post Trump. I think I guess we'll get to see a good example of it from the results of the Georgia election. That by the time this get posted, might have already happened. We might not know the results yet because it might take a while to count. Uh, but that'll be interesting to see, because if we continue to have one of our two major political parties, and if we're stuck in a two-party system where one of them is consistently going to not trust any systems that they do not control, and then won't even trust some of the systems that they do control, as the Georgia, uh, state government is already controlled by Republicans, just not ones that agree with Trump. If we have that party and that trend continuing, it's hard to see the American economy and the American government functioning at all. And if moderation returns, there'll still be challenges, but that would maybe be a more viable system. But I think we need to do something to kind of break the monopoly that these two sort of political ideologies have, and sort of break the gridlock as well.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great way to put it. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. It was a great episode, and we got to cover two really big events that are happening in media. And those things, just getting a better background of the situation is always super helpful. So thank you for providing your insight, Mr. Moore. Well, thank you guys for tuning in once again, and we'll see you guys next week.
Have a
Bye.
good 2021.